and welcome to the summary video of a series of really interesting interviews that I've been conducting over the last few months with senior leaders, a diverse group of leaders from business and from the Royal Air Force, the subject of which has been, of course, leadership, but more particularly the effect of a different value set from what we refer to as a post-millennial generation, the 18 to 25 generation, the effect of that changed value set on our organisations and on our style of leadership. So the interviews have been conducted on behalf of the Tedder Academy at the Royal Air Force College Cranwell and the Lincoln International Business School at the University of Lincoln. And what I intend to do here is just pick up on some of the more interesting insights which will hopefully whet your appetite for going watching the full-length videos which are also available on the website. As you might expect, one of the really important themes that emerged from it is the influence of technology on the value set of a generation that's often been referred to as the digital native generation. In other words, they've grown up with the influence of technology. So the first series of insights is from what our leaders are thinking about in terms of how this is affecting the way they're behaving inside our organisations. I think the first of these themes is what one of our leaders referred to as the goldfish bowl of performance. In other words, the effect that it's having on their view of or their need for to be performing at all times. So here's what Ian Smith had to say about this aspect of performance in the post-millennial generation.
I think millennials and obviously younger people like myself, we're now trying to do more in a short space of time. So it's almost like an unplanned efficiency. That's the best way I can describe it. You know, if I look at some of myself or others, even in the workplace, we're trying to do 3 things in one time, but we don't know we're actually doing it. Even out of work, you know, you'll have somebody having 2 WhatsApp conversations, ordering a Just Eat and replying to an email, but they don't know they're doing it because the notifications are popping up on their phone, and they're actually just flicking between the 2, where a more older generation will probably have to do 1 at a time, in three lots of the time. And I've seen that, and I think the mindset as well, there's a lot of pressure. I think a lot of younger people now put a lot of pressure on themselves. I think this kind of perception to achieve is greater. You know, I think the influence of the outside world, I think a lot of people are, with social media, they're always looking at, I need to be achieving more, my friend's here, I need to be here.
So as Ian says, the young people of today are putting themselves under a lot of self-imposed pressure through this scrutiny that they feel through the use of social media. Another really interesting effect of this familiarity with social media and then the natural way that they use social media is a need for immediacy, the immediacy of feedback, the immediacy of review of performance. And this is something that is particularly engaging the Royal Air Force at the moment, as I discovered in my conversation with Christina Elliott. And here's what Christina says about the need for immediacy of feedback with this post-millennial generation.
What I did notice was a thirst for information and a thirst for knowledge and a sense of immediacy to decision making and the kind of facts behind decisions. And I think I reflected on that was the access to information that kids have today, or young people joining the Air Force through not just social media, but just access to the internet and being able to use emails and get instant. So they're used to sort of a battle rhythm and a response mechanism that generally is quicker than I think when I joined the Royal Air Force. And I think when that ability to, when they can't tap into that, initially there's kind of what do I do? But what I observed was, once that people get used to being in a different organisation that has a different framework around it, and that immediacy disappears, and the access to the internet or social media is not removed, but their access is limited, they do adjust.
So something I think that we're perhaps all recognising from our generation of 18 to 25-year-olds is this intense need to feel like they have to be part of something, part of a bigger picture, a wider purpose. But what seems to be interesting about this is that it's technology that is creating this, because they again feel like they're part of a worldwide generation created by social media. And this is a reflection that one of our younger leaders had, Peter Watson, and here's what he said about this need to feel part of a bigger picture.
I think the age-old thing of that millennials are lazy is completely wrong. Yeah. If you look at millennials, they work really hard. Almost work life becomes before their kind of personal life, and they're only part of something much bigger.
So building on a couple of the themes that we've already touched on, I had a very interesting interview with Danny and Nikki Cowley, who are the joint managers of Lincoln City Football Club. And they also talked, as you may not be surprised, they also talked about how this generation are using technology as part of the learning process, but in particular, how it's enabling this generation to be independent learners, in the sense that we don't have to teach them anymore, either as managers or as educators. But the technology is allowing them to learn for themselves, and that they are launching them on a voyage of discovery, essentially, as learners. And so here's what Danny and Nikki said about their work with young footballers.
I think probably the younger generation are probably more independent in terms of their learning than maybe the older players. The older players have been used to a much more didactic style, much more command style, just been told what to do and been pretty much follow the instructions. Whereas now the younger players have more of an opinion, maybe.
Okay.
And
prepared to express it.
And prepared to express it, and prepared to, I suppose, they're probably more open-minded.
So far we've been talking about some of the effects that technology has had on how this generation are changing or adapting their own style, and how we need to adapt with them. There are also a couple of other interesting effects that are going on, because of course our organisations aren't all about the new generation, and of course the RAF now is recruiting up to age 46. So a couple of very interesting observations or insights from one of our other interviewees who runs his own building company, relating a little bit to the old apprenticeship model. And he was talking about how the generations are learning from each other, how a young person of 18 or 19 is learning social skills from an older generation, and the older generation indeed are learning from the younger generation, almost in the old, centuries-old apprenticeship model. So here's what Steve Gelder had to say about the learning going on between generations.
Get a kid that's he's not great for the first few days. Generally, once he kind of latches onto the people around him, so and becomes a mirror of them. You know, I always tell a story about when we have, a plumber and put a young lad with it. To start with, the plumber's like, I'm too busy, I don't want this lad working with me. I've got enough on my plate or whatever. And so, sorry, Jeff, you're having him. You know, and he's going to spend a week or whatever with you, or he's going to spend 3 months with you. And then what I tend to notice when I look out my window and look at them walking around the yard, I notice that the the apprentice is walking, his body language is very much like the plumber. And the plumber who maybe is my age, in his 50s or whatever, who didn't want to have the guy, is kind of a little bit younger, and he's got into, he's never been on Snapchat before, but suddenly he's been introduced to lots of things like that. So I kind of find it works quite well. It seems to get my older lads a bit more up to date, and my younger lads, they seem to get the skills. It doesn't always work, but that's how I see it, really.
So my conversation with Chris Elliott also reflected part of this adaptation required of these young people as they join organisations. So they're changing and evolving as well. And she was referring a little bit to the need to limit technology in the younger generation, such that they can learn some of the more traditional skills that we need to be effective in any organisation, the RAF in particular. So here's what Chris Elliott had to say about the need to develop social skills and to limit the use of technology.
I do reflect on, we had one intake that was particularly challenging because the communication skills were not as maybe mature. Their eye contact, their ability to do body language was maybe not as you would expect, because they hadn't had that experience. But once you actually help them to read people and actually interact in a different way, they soon overcame any sort of perceived failings or any perceived challenges.
If you get passionate individuals and there's no structure, then that's a big problem. Right. So the big thing that we've grown in the last year is we've got heads of departments that are really specialists. So you've got head of creative, head of advertising, head of PR that are the best. So when I get the passionate person and I throw them into head of PR's column, he can get them to the right point. But if I just threw them into the agency and said, "See you later, guys, crack on," wouldn't work. But they've got, as long as they're in the right funnel, they'll be fine.
So you also heard there from Peter Watson, and I do find it particularly interesting to hear from Peter. He runs his own company, and actually he's part of this generation. So it's worth, I think, paying attention particularly to what he says about this requirement to set boundaries around the generation now coming into our workforce. I think another characteristic that has been very commonly spoken about the millennial and perhaps the post-millennial generation is the what's in it for me, that they're coming to our organisations with a very clear idea that they need to get something out of it, perhaps more out of it than they are putting in it. And so this was a particular theme for some of our interviewees, and here's Victor Adebowale talking from his perspective about what he's seeing in this change in values with our new generation.
My experience is that they're just not accepting the received wisdom. They're not expecting a job for life necessarily. They come in with demands rather than the other way around.
Rather than what we can do for you.
It's not so much what can you do for me. You're looking to have me, which I frankly find quite refreshing.
One of the things that we hear a lot about this generation is a word that I particularly dislike, which is that they're the snowflake generation, and as responsible for a few thousand undergraduates, I personally particularly reject this concept, but so do some of my interviewees. But we had to deal with this. This is a particular theme that I think is quite interesting for those of us who are managing the 18 to 25 generation. So Dean Fathers had a particular perspective on this, and he thinks it's a little bit more about their increased self-awareness. So let's hear what Dean has to say about that. His take on it is an increased self-awareness, particularly of mental health issues compared with previous generations. But as this was a common theme, Richard Bevan also had an idea about this as well, and he feels that, again, partly because of the influence of technology, in some ways also partly because of their upbringing, this generation do need more and regular and more consistent support from management than perhaps previous generations have been used to or have perhaps needed. So we'll also hear a little bit about Richard Bevan's take, which is about the increased need for a mentoring role for this new generation.
So one of the things that I've reflected on there around resilience is potentially that they're not lacking in resilience. I think what we're starting to see is a change in their attitudes towards mental health, towards being open and transparent about mental health. And I think they've seen some of the historical issues that people of our generation have had, where there has been a certain degree of I've forgotten what the word is I'm looking for.
Well, sang-froid, where you would just sort of, you wouldn't necessarily share some of these things. You would just kind of deal with these issues or suffer in silence.
It's stigmatism is the word I was looking for. So there was a certain degree of stigmatism attached to mental health in the past, where people wouldn't disclose that they've got mental health issues, and as a result, that became fairly traumatic for many people.
Indeed.
I think the millennial generation is much more open and transparent to the need to talk. I think they're much more communicative in a variety of different ways, and as a result of that, they're more prepared to talk about those sorts of things.
In terms of the people that accelerate their careers the quickest in that generation are those that realise that success and failure are very rarely too far apart. And to avoid failure, I mustn't do it on my own. I want to do it on my own, but I mustn't do it on my own. So therefore, I'm going to take the experience of, a lot of people call them mentors or coaches, and in sport, there are plenty of people that are willing to contribute.
One of the final characteristics of this generation that I'd like to touch on that emerged very strongly from several of our interviewees is the subject of diversity. This generation absolutely takes diversity for granted, and they are unwilling to accept organisations or individuals who don't share that value set. And in particular, not necessarily ethnic or religious diversity, but also cognitive diversity. And Victor Adebowale had a particular perspective on this, which you'll hear from now from him.
Millennials are, in this country, more diverse. So we have a more diverse community. I don't just mean race, I mean gender.
In every aspect.
And there's an expectation that they don't expect to be discriminated against. They expect the kind of intellectual diversity. They expect cognitive diversity to be seen as a plus rather than something to be defended against.
So what we've heard about so far is a summary of the characteristics of this post-millennial generation. Some of the most important themes that our leaders have raised in their experience about this generation. But of course, these characteristics are and will have some significant effects about how we choose to structure and organise ourselves. So there are 2 or 3 themes that I'd like to highlight that came out from that. Now, they're of course linked to this value set. So, for example, the first one of these is about the unwillingness of this generation to accept authority unquestioningly in the way that perhaps previous generations may have done. So they are, as we've said already, one of their value sets is for diversity. They are consensus-driven, consensus-oriented, and therefore one of the things that they're going to be looking for is for decision-making to be devolved to the lowest point effective in an organisation, regardless of job title or rank. And this is what they will be expecting. So if they have the ability and the authority to act in their roles, then they are more likely to thrive as a generation, because that's in accord with their value set and with the way that they think about organisation structures. And here's what Stephen Hillier had to say about this need to devolve decision-making through the organisation.
We need to empower people throughout our structure of our organisation, because the most junior person may be the most knowledgeable, maybe the most technically skilled in that particular area. So unless you empower that individual, then the organisation will not be as good as it could be.
Now, as an organisation researcher, I know that this can be a particular challenge for any organisation, especially a rank-based organisation like the Royal Air Force. But of course, our industry partners are also faced with the same challenge, and 1 or 2 of our partners had a quite interesting way of thinking about this. So you'll hear now from Andy Palmer, who had a particularly interesting term for how he describes this type of organisation structure that he termed consensual meritocracy.
So one of the perhaps disadvantages is because you opinionate amongst your network. When you look for consensus, generally it's good, but sometimes you miss that groundbreaking innovation. And whereas, let's say by contrast, let's use the baby boomer generation, which was a much more selfish generation, basically wouldn't look for consensus, would look for differentiation and how I stand out. You were much more likely to fail, but you were also likely to find those big innovations. So the millennial set probably has an advantage. I think, generally speaking, getting consensus, getting averaging makes your leadership more reliable. But at the same time, need to be cognizant of the fact that sometimes you miss the breakthrough. Yes, you've got to go with with your instinct.
So that's Andy's view, and of course he's starting to relate this a little bit to the subject of leadership, which is really the final part of what we'll be discussing here in this video. If we look outside the organisation, we know that organisations these days, the challenge for leaders and for the managers of organisations isn't just about running or leading the organisation itself, but also relating to external partners and organisations. And one of the things that was quite interesting to emerge from the videos is the nature of that relationship being based on partners. And why is that? Because that represents part of the value set of the post-millennial generation that they wish to work in partnership with rather than in competition with those around them. You can, if you think about it, you can trace that back also to their existence in social media, where they relate as equals with essentially a worldwide generation of the same age. And this is Dean Fathers talking about, from his particular perspective in the NHS, about moving from a competitor market-based relationship with organisation partners to one which is based on understanding and developing a shared value set.
But of course, true systems don't just work within those organisational forms, they work across the boundaries. And so we as an NHS are part of a wider network, working in that wider collaboration with others like housing or university